So this is my reading, commentary, and reflection on Parmenides, the Platonic dialogue. We are currently on part 19. So we're a decent way into this, and it has been a turbulent, maybe not turbulent, but it's been a road that has had an undulating topography. And sometimes it's taken a long time to find a flow state, a thought progression that is provoking and productive. Other times it's been easier, but all the same, it's been an experience, like it always is. So within the spirit of making this productive, I'd like to think for a moment about where we have been. I'm not sure exactly how in-depth I'll be, maybe quite short, I'm not really sure, but just to get the mind right on where we are. So I've spent a long time on the following paragraph that I'll read here. It's a bit of a long one. But, says Parmenides, consider whether it comes to be older and younger in this way. In what way? Says Aristotle. In the way that the one was shown to be older than the others, and they older than it. What of that? When the one is older than the others, it has surely come to be for more time than they. Yes. Go back and consider. If we add an equal time to more and less time, will the time more differ from the less by an equal or a smaller fraction? A smaller. So the one's difference in age in relation to the others will not be in the future just what it was at first. On the contrary, by getting an increment of time equal to the others, it will differ from them in age always less than it did before. Isn't that so? Yes. Wouldn't that which differs from anything in age less than before come to be younger than before in relation to those things it was previously older than? Younger. And if the one comes to be younger, don't those others, in turn, come to be older than before in relation to it? Certainly. So what is younger comes to be older in relation to what has come to be earlier and is older. But it never is older. On the contrary, it always comes to be older than that thing. For the older advances toward the younger, while the younger advances towards the older. And in the same way, the older, in its turn, comes to be younger than the younger. For both, by going towards their opposites, come to be each other's opposite. The younger coming to be older than the older, and the older younger than the younger. But they could not come to be so. For if they came to be, they would no longer come to be, but would be so. But as it is, they come to be older and younger than each other. The one comes to be younger than the others, because it was shown to be older and have come to be earlier, whereas the others come to be older than the one because they have come to be later. So that's the end of that paragraph. I finished last time, I think, like right in the middle of that paragraph, but I had spent some time, probably a number of hours, on the first half of it. And in the broader context, which I'll explain in a moment, it's really not the most complicated thing, I suppose. But its implications are quite complicated. And I think this is something that needs to be kept in mind. And perhaps there's more to be said than just the implications. It's one of those situations in which it seems, on the surface, like something that is understandable. But then once it is picked apart, it's something that's much more complicated than at once thought or believed. And from my perspective, that's probably perhaps it's an ego thing for which I assumed that my understanding of this would be greater at the outset. And I think, just as a side thought, that this experience can be relatively common in terms of human beings, that we may meet somebody that we feel like we understand them, and then as we get to know them, we realize that there are layers and layers of complexity underneath the surface for which we didn't realize that they were there. And again, this may be sort of our own ego blinding our eyes to what's greater or what's possible, given the individual, but who knows? Okay, so there are a few fundamental things that I think I need to bring up before we begin this. Without context, this seems like it doesn't make any sense at all, I'm sure, but we're talking about the One as one of the foundational identities of reality. It is composed of two primary parts. I've been using 3 parts technically, but it's oneness and being, the principle of oneness and the principle of being. And they are cohered together. And this coherence I call the bridge of coherence, and the expression of which is the effect of that identity. The identity is what we call the One. And I've been referring to the One as, and the expression of the One as a field by which, or a substrate by which the seeds of any sort of identity can be planted. And then through difference and other fundamental principles, motion being one, time being another, we see the progression. We see the change in identities. We see birth. We see existence. We see transformation. We see death. And the scale of this sort of thing it can be quite broad. We can start quite simple in a domain that I call the determinate sphere or determinate realm, in which we have terms that are nondescript, quite basic, like this and that, this, not this, inside, outside, center and periphery, these sorts of terms, very basic identity type terms. And it's not until we get into qualities that then we have a greater degree of uniqueness, that then as these descriptions come into play, they seem to be more of identities that we would recognize in our lives, even if they're not material. Now from this, we've been thinking about, we spent a lot of time before, not in the last episode I don't think, but some time talking about the mechanics of identity, and really trying to hammer home exactly what this determinate sphere is, and how the mechanics play out, how identities can exist without really having a strong, formalized separation between one thing and another. They can be quite loose, variable. And then moving from that place, having some difficulty understanding the transition, if the transition is necessary between that determinate space, or what I'll just sort of say offhand as a simplistic space, into a more complex space. I don't think it can be reduced to those terms, but it's a sufficient placeholder. Now, within this, we have the influence of time. Time is something that I've been defining as immeasurable. It's a dimension by which we are able to measure and to understand change. There's also possibility there, or probability. There is transformation. Within the transformation, we see birth, we see death, we see existence, we see stability, we see fragility. And all within these walls of time, let's say, we have the ongoing and persistent mechanics by which identities shift, change, and remain stable. Now, the definition of the word identity is something that is stable over time. It's stable across influence. And one of the things that we started talking about is not just time in terms of absolute, that I am older than somebody that is younger, let's say my niece, for example. There's an absolute age difference. But there's also a relative age difference. And we've been using the term that Parmenides has given us as more of a proportional difference, in which this implies not just absolute difference, but significance, which gets closer to what we are always after, which is the meaning or purpose of things. And we get this from the fraction example. So just to reread it, go back and consider, he says, if we add an equal time to more and less time, will the more differ from the less by an equal or a smaller fraction? A smaller. So the one's difference in age in relation to the others will not be in the future just what it was at first. On the contrary, by getting an increment of time equal to the others, it will differ from them in age always less than it did before. And it took me a while to understand that for whatever reason, but eventually it became clear what I think he is doing here, which again is giving us the opportunity to reflect on how. There's a couple things here. One is a little bit deeper. I think it hid from me for a long time, and it's going to take some time to remember where that was. But at least on the immediate level, this proportional difference gives us a significance, and that if, for example, I was only a few years older than my niece, the meaning of that difference in time would be less significant than it would be as it is at present, that I am over 30 years older than she is. Now, within the significance, there was also a conversation about what that meant. What does it mean for an identity not just to be older than another, but also older in the proportional sense, in which the effect of time on that thing may not be proportional to the effect of time on something else. So, for example, the effect of time on my niece is not the same as it is on me. And the reason for that is, barring an extraordinary circumstance, she is undergoing a lot more developmental changes than I am. I'm largely done developing. What I do grow into or grow out of is a function of my desire to change and to be better. Whereas her development is physical and it is mental. Her body is growing. It is not a mature body. Her mind is growing. Her linguistic skills and control is developing. And so the significance of a year on her life is much more significant than a year on my life. Or a year, for me, not much will change. Certainly not much will change in terms of my body or in terms of my mind. I might feel a little bit more aches and pains than she, but I'm certainly not growing in the way that she is or developing in the way that she is. And so within this example, at the least, we can see how there's a significance in time, whereas the absolute difference just does not satisfy that. And I think this opens up a broader reflection, which brings us to the present moment. We've been working on understanding the sentence that Parmenides says as the following: "Wouldn't that which differs from anything in age less than before come to be younger than before, in relation to those things it was previously older than?" So again, here we have to remember that we are not in absolute time-space, we are in proportional time-space. Or, in other words, we are in the significance of time landscape. If we stick with the proportional example, I think we may be boxed in. I'm not quite sure about that yet, but at the very least we have to be considering the significance and not just the base measure of time, which is important in and of itself for consistency and coherence. But as we said in the last episode, the Earth going around the Sun may give us some measure of time, but it doesn't really give us the meaning or the purpose of that time, the latter of which is more important. So let's stick with the example of myself and my niece, and we'll play around a little bit with the context. The assertion is that because there is a smaller fraction in the case of the older, in the case of myself, like if I add a year onto the whole of my life, I have sort of 1 added to 34. The significance of that, again barring an extreme situation, is going to be less than 1 year added onto the 2.5-year-old. And so in a relative way, it would seem that time, from the standpoint of the identity that is younger, that is not yet experienced to the pressures and the dynamism of reality, as it gets older and it is exposed to these stresses, it will be exposed to the potential for transformation. It will also be exposed to, if it manages to persist in the way that it is, it will be exposed to stability, if I should say it in that way. There's another reflection that I think from last episode that is going to be useful here, which is, regardless of what happens, even if there's an extreme example, let's say there's something that is extreme that my niece will experience in her young age that I did not experience and did not shape my identity in the way that it would shape hers. This is something that I struggled with, because what would this do, or what would this mean if an identity had undergone an experience that in some sense accelerated its age? What do I mean by that? Now here is the primary playground. What I mean is, much like some contagion that wishes to find a host, and much like a host and that host's resistance to that potential pathogen, the concept of immunity, defense, fight, brings up in mind a resilience, assuming that the identity is not subsumed by the pathogen or the foreign entity that comes in, and it resists it, and it maintains an aspect of its identity that was foundational from before to after. There is a change, though, in the identity. In part, the change is experience. How it's manifested, I don't know. Depends on the situation. But at the very least, we can say that the experience has caused an understanding on the part of that identity, in a way, sort of a dynamic understanding, by which a prior experience and its attempt to shape it was unsuccessful. Now, I want to be careful here because identity is something that stretches well beyond just the conscious experience of man. It's quite easy to use my experience. I think I should as I explain this, but I want to be careful not to move too far past what all other identities would experience or go through. And if I'm to anthropomorphize something, I don't want to introduce some confound in it that makes the analogy or the heuristic untenable. But going back to this experience, this hypothetical experience by which an identity encounters some potentially dramatic, life-altering situation, experience. In a certain sense, we can say that we are the sum of our experiences. There's more than just that, of course. But experience has a lot to do with how we view things. Experience outside of man, I'm trying to think about relatively static identities that don't have conscious experience, like a rock. But they do have an experience. And there is an identity there. There are points of transformation. The rock can be weathered away. It's not as oriented to preservation of its status as such, as an identity, as man might be. But I think that there is a concern there because there is an internal coherence and a motion and a direction there. It's just not as it's not in the same way. It's not like man's mind is self-aware and valuing of his experience in that way. But just like a dramatic experience can alter a rock, let's say, for example, and the rock can undergo such an experience that would lead to its destruction, sort of this pulverization of a rock, or perhaps it's solidified together under pressure into some conglomeration, and the identity changes. These sorts of events can happen at any point in the absolute difference, time difference of something. And the initial struggle with this is that, well, the assumption, the grounded assumption when we speak of the proportional domain or the fractional domain, is that in general, identities that are older, the significance of time means less to them than it does to the identities that are younger. But the experience, the sudden experience and the potential change can happen at any point. And so it raises questions about the nature of that significance. We can have a person that lives their lives without taking risk, without experiencing much, and not having the type of breadth of understanding and awareness that perhaps is somebody else that did. Somebody that maybe traveled, or had a family. I'm not really so sure the impact on travel, but it is an experience nonetheless. Now this, I think, brings us to a point. I won't close this, but it brings us to a certain point. Because the sentence that I read here, wouldn't that which differs from anything in age less than before come to be younger than before in relation to those things it was previously older than? That statement doesn't really compute with where we have been. So how are we conceptualizing this? Well, in the proportional sense, in terms of significance, what we have is a smaller proportion of time by the older than we do in the younger. Now, if we stay in the absolute difference realm, what we have is a reflection that wouldn't get us anywhere. It would cause us to think that this sentence is nonsensical. And perhaps it's not useful in some circumstances, but we have to be very careful about where we step here. Because I don't think it's the case that we should be moving to the absolute. That is to say that in the case of my niece and myself, we are not talking about a 30-year difference in this sentence. What we're talking about is the relative effect of time from one to the other. And there is a suggestion that because of this proportional difference, relative difference, that in fact, I am the one that is younger. And it would seem to hold on to a principle that we were using before. I'm becoming younger, let's say. I'm becoming less older than my niece, who is becoming older faster than I'm becoming older. From here, just as a side thought, the question is, well, when do these catch up? And again, leaving the absolute age difference aside, just saying for all practical purposes, it doesn't matter right now because it's not telling us the significance. What is telling us the significance is the proportional difference. In some sense, regardless of my age, because of the absolute difference, because of the 30-year difference, there will always be this aspect of me becoming less older and she becoming older faster. Now, this analogy might break down as I reach the elderly age, and in fact, my mind begins to reverse. But actually, this might serve the counter-argument yet again, in the sense that as I move into that elderly age, and as the susceptibility of the change in identity increasing, just as a young identity might be susceptible, then for all meaningful domains, it would seem that me becoming less older still applies. And in fact, by this difference in acceleration, difference in motion, as sort of the partner wed to time, I am becoming functionally younger, purposefully younger. Again, going back to Parmenides' sentence, wouldn't that which differs from anything in age less than before come to be younger than before in relation to those things it was previously older than? And if the one comes to be younger, don't those others, in turn, come to be older than those before in relation to it? Now, I mentioned at the outset that there is a deeper meaning to this. And keeping in mind that this conversation started because we were bouncing back and forth between these ideas of the one coming to be both older and younger than the others. others meaning things that are distinct from the identity of the one. Not to say that they don't participate in the expression of the one, which of course all things do, but others as it is separated from the identity of the one that facilitates all of this that we see before us, or don't see. Now, of course, this raises questions of time and ways of seeing time. We had our absolute, and we had our proportional. And it seems yet that I've been found wanting of this time difference. That there's something more in time. Perhaps it's in the proportional domain, I'm not really sure. I don't think it's in the absolute. That satisfies this conception of the one. The conception being the image that is produced by the relationship between the one and time. Now, my apologies, but today is a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. But just for a moment, to reflect on the thought of yesterday, thinking about the relationship between the one and time is fundamental. But I want to move ourselves closer to the text again, so I want to read our sentence that we've been working on. Wouldn't that which differs from anything in age less than before come to be younger than before in relation to those things it was previously older than? And if the one comes to be younger, don't the others, in turn, come to be older than before in relation to it? Okay, so we have this idea of the significance of an age difference, not just the absolute age difference. And within the significance of this age difference, we have a particular proportion as it relates to the older and the younger. Of the one, we can say that the one is quite old. If we add a year to the one's identity, it's likely not to change. If we add a year to my niece's age, a lot will change. And this pattern, in a relative sense, continues all the way up until they're the same age, in the absolute sense, if that were possible. But since we're not restricting ourselves to the absolute age, it means that the significance of time is what we have to focus on. The passage of it means more to one than it does to the other. And so we get into this potentially confusing language, and in which we have the thought of something being less older or an older, younger identity. The rate at which the younger identity is maturing is faster than that of the older identity. And because of that, we have this sort of image in our minds of the younger identity approaching the older. And even as we consider the older, perhaps on the decline of its identity lifespan, that it may be find itself reversing in many of those stable traits that it had accumulated in order to preserve itself. This is something that applies more to man, I think, than many things. But still, it's something that's true. And if the one comes to be younger, don't those others in turn come to be older than before in relation to it? So let's think about this idea of the one coming to be younger than the others. Now, in the sense of significance, the one is an identity, the field of potential, or the field, rather, of the expression of oneness and being that allows for all things to emerge through difference, to coalesce and to separate and to be influenced and to influence. All of this is woven by the one. And given our definition of time, being that it involves change, it involves movement, it involves possibility, it involves the transfer of information over a particular I want to say space of movement, but that's not exactly where I'd like to go with it. I would say period of movement, but again, that implies time. I don't want to snake eating its own tail definition. Progress is another word, but it implies that it is always moving towards a type of betterness, maybe, which is not what I wish to say. It's not pure movement in the sense, because it would restrict its own identity to that of motion, which of course it's separate from, even if motion is a part of it. It's something much like oneness and being, that it facilitates. It facilitates the interactions. A field on top of a field interwoven into another field. The fields themselves are interwoven in those things that emerge within those fields. So in terms of significance, the time, the change that occurs in the life of my cat is much more significant than the change that occurs in that of the one. But here we've been over this territory multiple times, and this is not where the true significance of this lies. And the question is, well, where does it rest? How are we to think about the one becoming younger? Functionally, what does that mean? It means, in the using our definition, in terms of significance, it means that it is becoming less resilient, in a way. There's much more here, I can feel it. It's not less resilient because the one is going to fall apart. In my mind, I see this interwoven fabric, but there's a special thread throughout the whole that if you were to unravel that special thread, it would unravel the whole of that thing. Now, the interesting thing is that not only does the whole that this single thread weaves is present, it is something, it is the reality, but on the other hand, there are so many fine gradations, so many independent structures that emerge based on the interweaving of this thing, that we cannot easily say, as we identify one thing, to switch to the thread of the whole and to reflect on it in the same manner. Not that we can't, but in many situations it's not practical to do so, because we're considering the relationships among two very specific things, regardless of their extreme fundamentals when we think about their philosophical principles or underpinnings. But I have to wonder, there's this fleeting image in my mind that I'm trying to consolidate. As a matter of perspective and the shift of the mind as it considers the thread that permeates the whole versus the parts of that whole, the independence that emerges from those parts, or the idea of that being a part, about the relevance of the parts as they relate to each other, about wholeness as it finds itself within a segment or a piece or a part of another whole. I start with perspective because shifting the mind to the one as opposed to keeping the mind on something that is immediate to me right now, like the microphone or my cat or any number of material things in my living room, it seems as though the attention, the point of focus, it matters, and it matters even as we consider the one becoming younger. Now, before, I've gone down this road, I think, a few times by now. I've made the assertion or made the argument that the one can be younger as it integrates itself into another identity, or it's transformed in a way that a new identity emerges. But this is not where I think Parmenides wants us to go. We're talking about the significance and not the absolute. Getting caught between the two is a mistake. In the significance of this thing, we say that the identity of the one is subject to change or to rapid flows of information change. On one hand, as we reflect on this, the potential is that the entire substrate is changed because of some identities or some influence that information has on this thing relative to another. And if we are to say that this one becomes younger, we say that perhaps it's less experienced. But how can it be less experienced if it has experienced all of these things? Now, the one itself hasn't experienced everything that the one affords, which is a strange irony, I think. And maybe that's where the key is. That the one as an identity, as we can compare it to the others, that within its simplicity, within its lack of transformation in time, although we have this stability, we also have that type of complacency for which a man may live a life that is unexplored, unutilized, and passive. And because of this unexplored and unutilized or passive disposition, what he finds and is lacking is a certain youthfulness and adolescence of his experience, of his mind, of his behavior, or whatever, of his sociability. And by this, it's not an absolute youngness. It's a relative youngness. It's a significance of youngness because of the lack of experience and exposure. And I have to wonder, as a matter of perspective, that the identity of the one is not the whole of reality, of course, but as it is that identity, as it is unchanged, but as many things are, and many things are one, and continually move to and fro, the one doesn't undergo that experience. It is how it is. It is one, and it is. So what is younger comes to be older in relation to what has come to be earlier and is older. But it never is older. So here we have the explanation of the proportional, the significance of time relative to the absoluteness of time. So what is younger comes to be older in relation to what has come to be earlier and is older. So it's older, younger than something that is that has come to be earlier and is older. But it's not older in an absolute sense. It always comes to be older than that thing. For the older advances towards the younger, while the younger advances towards the older. And in the same way, the older, in its turn, comes to be younger than the younger. For both, by going towards their opposites, come to be each other's opposite. The younger coming to be older than the older, and the older younger than the younger. But they could not come to be so. For if they came to be, they would no longer come to be, but would be so. So this is where we have to pause. So we introduced another concept when he says, on the contrary, it always comes to be older than that thing. Now, on one hand, it's easy, perhaps, to dismiss and not go through the exercise. But if we imagine the significance of this, and we think about the one reducing and the others progressing, all the while holding on to this token of existence given to it by the expression of the one, but not the one itself. What does it mean for the one to become younger? Is there a renewal in the fabric itself? That's what it would seem to suggest. Well, what does it mean to have a renewal in the fabric? What does it mean for the others? For the older advances towards the younger, while the younger advances towards the older. Again, this is in terms of significance, not in terms of absolutes. So the younger become more stable. They become these beacons of, maybe not just stability, but these beacons of experience, the paragons of that heroic enterprise that we associate with those steadfast identities. While the one becomes penetrable and thereby its expression becomes variable, non-predictable. And there's this reverberation that occurs from that. But the primary thing there to think about would be, what is the influence on the identity of the one? For in some sense, the identity itself can't change. The parts have to be the same. The one and being have to be there. But what about oneness and what about being themselves? Surely there's an internal mechanics there. So today happens to be a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. Now I want to get back to where I was, because it's an important springboard into a fruitful conversation. However, I do need to build myself up into this conversation. So from what I remember, I'm still having difficulty understanding in a more intimate manner the significance of the older becoming younger and the younger becoming older, and the two sort of meeting each other. Our definition of time has been expanded to include the significance, yes, but also the internal mechanics of what happens to the older as it becomes less older relative to the younger that becomes older younger. And then, more in Parmenidean language, he says, so what is younger comes to be older in relation to what has come to be earlier and is older, but it never is older. On the contrary, it always comes to be older than that thing. For the older advances toward the younger, while the younger advances toward the older. And in the same way, the older in its turn comes to be younger than the younger. And while there may be a few fruitful paths to go down here, the one that came to mind was the internal dynamics of the one, because we have to understand the internal dynamics of the one if we are to consider the significance of time. So this is approaching our true definition, which involves meaning and purpose of time, which is exchange of information, its potential of transformation between identity states. It is a marriage, or perhaps built of a part which includes motion, and this motion gives us a particular direction, and because of that motion and direction, we have the change that occurs, and we measure it by the dimension of time. That there has been some period that has elapsed, and then within that period there is some significance, and so we're diving more into that volumetric space, the three-dimensional space, as opposed to the two-dimensional linear space. And so when we think about the one, as it is in the sense of significance becoming younger, I don't think it's becoming younger in terms of stability. It's not becoming less stable, per se, but it's becoming open to new experience, or exposed to new experiences that perhaps it was not before, as it returns to this youthful stage. And I have to also imagine that maybe this is an utilized heuristic, that when a person becomes younger, the novelty of experience increases, and the nature and relationships of the identity will adjust accordingly to that novelty and to whether it be good or bad. Now we know, in the grand scheme of things, that the one cannot change all that much, otherwise that which is planted in the soil of that field would not blossom into anything. It would not include difference in any meaningful way, and we wouldn't have the abundance of different identities that we have. So I wonder at the internal mechanics of the one. We know that there are two parts, three technically perhaps, at least in my conception. We have oneness, and we have being, and then we have the coherence, which I call the bridge of coherence that sort of unites the two. And then by that uniting, we have the expression and also the formation of the identity, which is the one. Now the parts themselves, just like many things, are identities, and they are identifiable, they are intelligible, they can be described. And so here I wonder at the significance of the one and being as it relates to this process of becoming younger. Okay, so the first thing to do here, I think, is to establish a coherence to Parmenides' argument, and then move into the area that I want to move into. It's related to his argument, but it's a bit moving. I'm putting things into the argument, let's say, that maybe I shouldn't be putting there. So I think we have to keep in mind that the immediate argument of becoming younger still means relational diminution of seniority. So the older becomes younger than the younger. It doesn't mean that we're regaining novelty per se, or there's increased openness, or there's some rejuvenation, or instability of essence. It's more narrow, and it's related to this proportional difference. It's still arithmetic. Each side, the younger and the older, approaches the other in relative standing as equal time is added to both. And so in that, even if we're in the proportional domain, even if we're in a domain of significance, and we've established some surface level of significance by which there's a general trend by which that which is older has experienced more, has stood the test of time, the identity is probably more stable than the younger. But then the proportional implies that the time to the younger has a greater impact than the time relative to the older that's added. And so it's a bit difficult for me to see how the older advances towards the younger in this case, rather than it just being slower, moving at a slower rate than the younger, because it's experiencing more so rapidly that it's going to catch up to the older. But the older advances towards the younger because its original seniority becomes proportionally less dominant. The younger advances towards the older because it proportionally closes the gap. And so it seems like the older is falling from grace in a certain respect, in terms of its hold on the significance of time. So becoming older means becoming less young relative to the other than before. Okay, so that being said, we can move into the deeper thoughts about the internal mechanics and then the particulars of the significance. So what we've been pushing into are these ideas that have not yet been formalized, but ideas in which generally when something is becoming younger, I've said that in a way that they're more childlike or they're less stable. This is not, I think, philosophically rigid. It's consistent with where we have been, but I think we have to do a little bit more work in describing exactly what I mean by this. So if we think about the one becoming younger in the proportional sense, I think about an experience that I had today with a coworker and existing paradigms and thoughts and beliefs about things. And it was within the sort of surface level reflection, more of a feeling really than an actual articulation, but nonetheless it's meaningful here. That when we approach something that is new, which would almost be akin to something that is younger, but of course identities approach things all of the time, regardless of their age, but we think about youth interacting in a particular way. That age and experience has done something to the network, the field, by which they relate. And I think that there's a certain dominance that occurs in age and in stability. There's a dominance of relational standing. And we can think about this in terms of network, because when something becomes solidified or stable in this manner, it's a reliable component of the network. It forms a crucial component of it. There's a relational standing. And in the youthful context, what we have is a not as sophisticated or firm integration into this relational standing, and it's more open to a reconfigured field of interaction. And the implications of this, I think, is in some sense a definition, or rather a description, of the mechanics at work. Not too specific yet, still broad, but it's a description of the mechanics in the sense that if we understand an identity to find itself in a place, a home, let's say, or a place of stability, a mature condition, it would find itself in a field of interaction that is regular. There's still change taking place there, but it has found, as in the adjective of home, or the description of home, that there is a place of rest in a relative sense. This place of rest maintains the essence of the thing quite well, despite the dynamic moving components. So as we have this experience of time progressing, and we have this forward-moving identity states, one being older, one being younger, in terms of significance, their relationality is seen to be modified. It's not about strict age, but rather, as they endure together through time, the significance of their relations change, and the change in significance can become a condition for this, what we might reach into as qualitative transformation. So a condition for qualitative transformation. Before this point, we haven't really broached the topic of the emergence of qualities. But here we have a point at which we are ready for qualities, because the proportional change is not the quality itself. But it may be a mechanism by which a field becomes ready for a quality. So let's think about what is meant by a significance of a relation. This can be quite simple. I could take the most immediate thing that comes to mind for me. My cat is sitting in my lap. This is a type of relation. There's a social relationship that's happening here. The cat is demonstrating social behavior by purring. I'm demonstrating social behavior by petting the cat. I am demonstrating a relational change in the sense that I'm annoyed because my cat jumped up on the table and brushed against the microphone. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the relationship there in real time had changed. Not in an extreme way, because we still have that social bond and social connection. The cat is sitting on the table, still purring in front of the microphone. But there was a point that was facilitated by time, in the sense that there was a significance that happened in terms of the relation. It didn't stay static. The cat just didn't live out its identity within the confines of my lap, nor did our social interactions maintain themselves within those bounds. It changed. And it had a relatively minor significance to it, but there was a change. And significance in this sense just means that there was some meaningful change, let's say. Now, in this space, we're talking about identities that are very descript. They have qualities. My cat has qualities. I have qualities, and so it's natural, of course, to think about this scenario. But today is a new day, and so I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit. Hopefully not too much from where we were. But I want to try to give a little bit of a recap as I enter into this thought experiment or exercise again. So what's interesting to me is that in the beginning, or near the beginning, we started quite blank. We had a blank slate by which we were trying to outline and describe reality, essentially. And we started in the formal domain, and we worked our way down to the base of something. In this base, we were centering around being and oneness. We had thoughts about purity. And while we came off of the sophist, the dialogue of the sophist, we had done a lot of experimenting and exercises related to difference and how it relates to being. And so there are some preconceived notions there. And as we moved away from the purity of the one as something that is non-articulate and nondescript, pretty much non-intelligible, we moved from that to something that includes difference, that is articulate, that can be said that it is composed of parts, though down at the bottom of the articulate order, it's hard to consider the parts of a whole in the same way as we do higher up the stack, in the sense of a human being or in the sense of the table that's in front of me, because it can be highly variable. Its identity can be destroyed quite easily. The parts can be rearranged quite easily. It would be painful in my case, but not so much in the case of the table, but still quite easy to rearrange its parts if need be. And then we began the long conversation about the determinate order. And this is a domain that includes terms. It includes identities, but identities that are pre-quality. And all of these terms, they give us a rough estimation or a rough identification for what these identities are. We had a definition about some persistence of being over time as a rough definition for an identity. As we expanded our determinate grammar, we had more and more terms to add on to what an identity might be. But being nondescript, it's quite difficult to think about an identity as something that is within that landscape. All the while, we're sort of considering a linear view of time, in the sense that an identity is born in this determinate scape and then it picks up qualities later on. Moved away from that a little bit. Eventually, we started to think about how these terms and how the identities themselves might relate to other identities. And there's one of my favorite examples that came from this exercise was the different types of boundaries that one could witness within an apartment or a house. And there's quite firm boundaries. There are quite loose boundaries. One of the examples that I used was the boundary between my living room and my dining room. There's no complete partition, but there are certain architectural signifiers by which one would understand that there's a separation between two rooms, even though it's very open. And then we broadened that scale out. We tried to think about the fundamentals of what that experience was, what it meant to identities in the determinate landscape. That was a fruitful exercise. And then through the time of exercising, failing, and succeeding at certain reflections and all of this sort of thing, a continual topic was, where are the qualities? How do they emerge? How do they integrate into this the determinate landscape to make it a determinate and also descriptive landscape? And though I'm paraphrasing where we've been, because we're in part 19 right now, which means if we're going to give a rough estimate that every episode is 2 hours, we're by the end of this, we're going to be 38 hours of spoken word into the dialogue. So there's a lot that's not being said here. There's a lot perhaps that I don't even remember. But I bring this up because what is beginning to form, bizarrely enough, is this picture of identity formation. And it's still, it's at this place where it is being birthed, but it's still difficult to articulate. And this aspect of time, as we've stumbled on this aspect of proportional time, some things we may leave and other things I'm sure to take. This description of volumetric time as opposed to linear time, I think, has been quite useful. All of the things that I've mentioned, I think, need caveats, and perhaps I've been, at some points, I've been more generous with my language than others, more precise, philosophically precise than others. But with this volumetric view of time, what we have is not just A, B, and C. We have a thickened relation. We have a transmission, we have retention, interaction, mutual approaches, significance gradients. If linear time tracks sequence, volumetric time tracks density. redistribution of relational significance across the sequence. It is one of our first glimpses at this volumetric view of time. It might not be the only one. In fact, I don't think it's the only one because I've been trying to stretch it, I think, beyond its natural intention, beyond what Parmenides is, the point Parmenides is trying to make, which is very logical and strict. I'm trying to have a little bit more fun, fluid exercise with it. Perhaps that's a failure of mine, I'm not sure. But it becomes quite clear that we are in a heavily relational dependent landscape. And what is also clear is that everything is not, when I say relational, everything is not relative. There are a lot of dependencies. And exactly what is, and at what level, at what scale, is beginning to become more and more important. And I think we are on the cusp of this integration of the descriptive landscape and the determinate. We've been talking in the descriptive landscape for a long time now. We've sort of left the determinate language behind and stopped doing a lot of those exercises. But as we've approached the one and its internal mechanics, I think we're getting even closer to that marriage or that union. I've maintained that the one is something that is composed of parts in a way, not parts, like I said at the outset of this, in the same way that I am composed of parts or the table is composed of parts. There are these quasi-independent components, principles, that are tightly woven together, but distinct, quasi-independent. Oneness and being are these principles that make up the one. They're distinguishable, but they're not detachable pieces. The coherence of them, the bridge of coherence, as I've been referring to it as, is not a third item added to this experience. It's the living intelligibility of their inseparability. And from this coherence, I've often used the result as the expression. The word that I used just now, living intelligibility, is, I think, an equivalence to that. And I've been bouncing back and forth, I think, between thinking about the older and younger business as it relates to the one as the identity. The identity of the one, of course, is different than the effects, let's say. But there is a relationship there. There's always a relationship. And part of me wants to say that the one as an identity is a concept. But I don't want to reduce it to just a concept. It is a placeholder of sorts that is necessary. Is it necessary just for my mind? I'm not sure. So I ask, why is it necessary? Because the one is as an identity is something that's coherent. It's intelligible, and it can be labeled as such. So we call it the one. But there are different aspects. We can identify the one as ground, and in this case, we are implying an identity descriptor to something of its effects, of its expression, of its living intelligibility. And I think that this can create some confusion, and this is something that needs to be controlled against. Once we get to the living expression, we're moving up in the stack of the articulated order. oneness is not, as the principle, is not becoming younger. Being is not becoming younger. The coherence of the ground does not have a proportional age. These sorts of things are pillars, unchanging pillars that are necessary to even facilitate time. They sort of precede time in this way. Or at least they're earlier than other articulate things, if we can't say that it precedes time, which I don't think would be accurate. Now, the point that we're getting to here is something I've been juggling for a while. I go back and forth trying to test and refute it. But the graduated nature of their articulated order is something that is fundamental. What do I mean by this? I mean, when we started thinking about the one and thinking about being in terms of the internal mechanics of the one as potentially being changed because of the identity of the one itself becoming younger relative to the others. The idea was, let's examine this and try to figure out if these principles have enough structural capacity to change in the sense that slight variations in the order or in the field, in the expression of that coherence, is possible, and such that those reverberations would move themselves out into the latter forms of the stack of the articulated order. So let's give some definitions of oneness and being. Oneness is what keeps an identity gathered enough that temporal redistribution does not dissolve it. And in everything that we've been talking about, in the graduated sense, when we have identities that are related to each other, when we have identities built upon identities, or wholes, or unifications that are built on simpler, more fundamental parts, when we think about any scale of this, we can think about a tree, we can think about something as simple as a rock, we can think about an atom, we can think about a single person, we can think about a family, we can think about a society. There are so many different levels and layers by which we can examine all of these different relationships. Without oneness, there is no same thing advancing through time, only fragments or unrelated phases. And even the fragments themselves, or the phases, would be something. And so it's something that's unified. A fragment, as bizarre as it seems, or a plurality, is something. It's something that's identifiable. And so if there's no oneness, there wouldn't even be that thing. But saying fragments or phases is a useful heuristic by which we can conceptualize of the potential absence of oneness as a principle. So again, oneness grounds persistence through difference. Now, being, on the other hand, is what allows that identity to actually stand forth and participate in relation. Without being, there's no actuality of the identity, no presence in the articulated order. So it grounds this actuality in relation. And the oneness as the principle brings it into something that is stable. It resists the temporal pull towards a redistribution because of these constant interacting forces. And by these, we can see that it's difficult to describe one without the other because the coherence is the inseparable functioning of the two. The identity is one enough to remain itself, and real enough to enter relations, change significance, and endure in a temporal unfolding. But I think that where we are now is moving back to a prior conception, or maybe rather establishing more firmly a prior conception, which is that the one as an identity does not change. Being where it is in the articulate order affords it a particular aspect, a way about it, of stability. The affordance landscape is something that needs to be stable in order for the expressions to have all of this variability. And what's interesting is they all maintain this constant participation of oneness in being. But what we have here is an identity that is grounded in oneness in being, that is being resituated within a changing relational field of significance. I think this is where the heart of the proportional domain points us. It's not the one itself. So I think what we can salvage of what Parmenides is saying here is the identities that are effectively little microcosms of the broad potential expanse that the one, the identity of the one that it provides us. In these individual identities, we can still have that exercise within that framework, within that domain. So I'd like to steer us back to the dialogue so we don't get too far from it. On the contrary, he says, it always comes to be older than that thing. For the older advances toward the younger, while the younger advances towards the older. And in the same way, the older in its turn comes to be younger than the younger. For both, by going towards their opposites, come to be each other's opposite. The younger coming to be older than the older, and the older younger than the younger. But they could not come to be so, for if they came to be, they would no longer come to be, but would be so. But as it is, they come to be older and younger than each other. The one comes to be younger than the others, because it was shown to be older and have come to be earlier. Now this is something that I don't understand. The rationale for the one becoming younger than the others, because well, on one hand I do understand it. If I fall into linear time, then of course I don't understand it, but in terms of our proportional time, then it's understandable. That the one, by proportion, will always age at a rate that is less. Not in the absolute sense, but in the sense of significance, than the others. Whereas the others come to be older than the one, because they have come to be later. And by the same argument, too, and by the same argument, the others, too, come to be younger in relation to the one, since in fact they were shown to be older than it, and have come to be earlier. Yes, it does appear so. Well then, insofar as nothing comes to be older or younger than a different thing, owing their always differing from each other by an equal number, the one would not come to be older or younger than the others, and they would not come to be older or younger than it. But insofar as things that come to be earlier must differ from things that come to be later by a fraction that is always different, and vice versa, in this way they must come to be older and younger than each other, both the others than the one, and the one than the others. Of course. To sum up all this, the one itself both is and comes to be older and younger than itself, and the others, and it neither is nor comes to be older or younger than itself or the others. Exactly, says Aristotle. Okay, so this is essentially a summary paragraph. And I have to admit that I'm getting a little fatigued by our approach here. But I think there's one big takeaway from this. There's all of this language for which we get stuck in the relative landscape, that nothing is older than anything else, that the one is older than itself and younger than itself. It all becomes meaningless very quickly. Unless we recognize that because of the constant shifting of attention, we find ourselves within the landscape of shifting relevance. And by that shifting relevance, I think we can justify almost anything. In our exercises, though, there has been a structure that is emerging that points to the heavy importance of the relationships that emerge between identities. And we've, I think, produced a healthy definition of time. So Parmenides continues, and he says, "And since the one partakes of time, and of coming to be older and younger, must it not also partake of time past, future and present, if in fact it partakes of time? Necessarily. Therefore, the one was, and is, and will be, and was coming to be, and comes to be, and will come to be sure. And something could belong to it, and be of it, in the past, present, and future. Certainly. And indeed there would be knowledge and opinion and perception of it, if in fact, even now, we are engaging in all those activities concerning it." You're right. "And a name and an account belong to it, and it is named and spoken of, and all such things as pertain to the others also pertain to the one." That's exactly so. Now, today is a new day in which I return to this podcast with a renewed vigor, let's say. And I had the feeling yesterday that the exercise that we've been tasked with has been fraught with difficulties. For on one hand, I'm trying to move away from the one as the identity in question, by which we are narrowing ourselves into thinking that that thing is something that is in competition with or aging with in the same fashion as what Parmenides is calling the others. Now, I believe it to be the case that the one we can consider in a few different respects. And so I think there's a few fruitful territories or paths to go down, one of which is one well known and which I seem to prefer as of late. That is saying that there is something fundamental about the ground by which the one seemingly operates. The expression of the one facilitates. It is something that is unmoved in a way, though not outside of time. It is not affected like other identities are affected. The way in which it's affected seems almost to confuse the mind, in the sense that when we speak about the way in which the field of potential and the field of possibility, how this may emerge, perhaps not even possibility, but perhaps the field of potential, the relational environment by which information is exchanged, by which information comes into oneness, disassociates into otherness, from birth to death, from beginning to end. In all of these experiences, we do have the one and the expressions, the angular expressions. Now, of course, this is separate from the one proper, which we've been describing as having or being composed of these parts, but these parts are fundamental parts that are married together, not like component pieces that are easily separated. They are non-separable component pieces. Whereas other identities, the internal mechanics are a little bit more subtle. They can be much more dynamic and mobile. That the parts themselves in otherness can shift and change, but at a certain point, the fundamentals, the ground, needs to be stable enough to be able to handle that difference and the expression of that difference. The frustration comes in when we find ourselves in the relative territory. We say that the one may be in everything, that the one is older and younger than itself and other things. Again, Parmenides says, well then, insofar as nothing comes to be older or younger than a different thing, owing to their always differing from each other by an equal number, the one would not come to be older or younger than the others, and they would not come to be older or younger than it. And so we find ourselves in this proportional landscape making these statements that are very hard to understand and to conceptualize. Now, I understand that a lot of this is procedural, and by the logical framework by which these dialogues unfold, we have to adhere to the structure. And I think that there are upsides and downsides to this structure. This potential downside is continually having to navigate where we are, while having the capacity and the faculties to extend and to branch into territories that may be more productive in the immediate sense, or maybe more gratifying in the immediate sense. So prudence, at times, I find difficult to exercise. Parmenides continues and he says, but insofar as things that came to be earlier must differ from things that come to be later by a fraction that is always different, and vice versa, in this way they must come to be older and younger than each other. And so we have this I think the saving grace is the understanding of the broad network and the broad interplay of relations among things. But speaking about it too broadly, I think we miss the relevance. We miss the importance even when we dive into the proportional sphere, and we're talking about significance. The significance itself can be lost. As far as relevance is concerned, the same interval no longer means the same thing relative to what each of these identities may be as we consider nounness. And by these unfolding and changing dynamics, I think it's difficult to track, especially when we're speaking broadly, but need specific examples to be able to track something. Now, we've intermixed some specific examples, like myself and my niece situation, and my friend's daughter, and a few other examples. I think we could take any two identities. I had this experience not long ago, looking at my shoes and looking at how they've worn. I look at the new ones and I look at the old ones. The old has been rebuffed in certain ways. I've replaced the insoles, I've replaced the laces. The new is beginning to come to the point where it needs to have replaced laces and replaced insoles. But they remain different. They remain robust in terms of their sheen and the padding on the shoes. The glue that holds that padding there is still strong, whereas on the others it's beginning to wear a little bit, and it separates from the seam. And here, it's not about absolute difference in age. I could have left the older pair of shoes in the box while I wore the younger, and the younger would appear purposefully aged. It would be significantly older by its worn appearance. And since I've stopped wearing the older shoes, except to put them on, I keep the laces untied, tuck them in the shoe. They're easy shoes to slip on now. But before, they used to be work shoes. Now I have new work shoes that I wear every day, and it's quickly becoming the case that these newer work shoes are wearing down, just the way that the older ones had. And so in a way, in terms of relative age, I'm using less miles on the older shoes and more miles on the older. And by that, the effects of this relational significance is felt, such that the younger shoes, in the absolute sense, are becoming older because they are being exposed to a greater degree within the relational landscape. And it's because of that unfolding of relation that we have this significance and relevance occur. Relevance in the sense that the younger shoes in the absolute sense are becoming now older than the older shoes. The proportional sphere is not about vague significance. Time alters not merely what things are separated by, but how that separation counts for them. Now I want to pause here and bring up an idea just from a moment ago, that if we get caught in too broad of a reflection, then we'll find some other example or analogy that might sort of work against what I'm trying to say here. Or at least it'll make the relevance of this shoe example less prominent. And this is something that earlier in this episode we've struggled with a lot. Going back and forth between significance in absolute. In the absolute sense, if I wanted to save a pair of shoes from 200 years ago and then begin to wear shoes from today, of course it wouldn't work. The 200-year-old shoes would have undergone an identity shift to the significance that I can no longer be able to identify the 200-year-old shoes because they've dissociated to a point where the relational relevance of its underlying constitution no longer supports that thing that I am attending or wishing to attend to. And so there's that reflection by, well, if there's an absolute time difference that's significant enough, then how can we get into the proportional domain? But that's sort of a contradiction, because it's when we have the absolute time difference, then bringing in significance automatically brings in this proportional time difference. It just happens at different scales of relation. If one identity is exposed to an environment in which it cannot last that environment before a new identity comes through to then participate into some comparative analogy, then we can't have that comparative analogy. So in order to avoid this, I think what we need is some layering or levels. So the first level we can say is the one is ground. This is not one being among beings. It is not simply an older thing standing next to younger things. At this level, predicates like older and younger do not apply straightforwardly. But then we have, when we speak about the one, we have the one in the context of articulated discourse. And once the one is allowed into predication, it becomes caught in the web of this relational language. And it can be said to be older, younger, equal in itself, in another, and all the rest. But this is not the pure ground. This is the one as thinkable within articulated being. Then the third layer is the others and the relational field, where we have the articulated multiplicities, the things whose relations can be counted, compared, proportioned, and temporally unfolded. So the predicates of older, younger, they apply differently depending on whether we are speaking of the ground, the articulated one, or the others. And I think the most difficult is speaking not necessarily of the one as the ground, or of the others. It is of the articulated one. The articulated one as it differs from the others. Now when Parmenides says, "And since the one partakes of time, and of coming to be older and younger, must it not also partake of time past, future, and present, if in fact it partakes of time?" Here we're talking about the second layer. We're talking about the articulated one. This is the one that is used in discourse. This is the one that refers to level one. The one is ground, but is housed within the fabric of the relational grammar. And because it is housed there, we have to use all of these terms And we find the older, we find the younger, we find the expression, we find the relationship of the expression to the third layer, the others and the relational field. But we have to understand that much like as we began speaking about the one as an unarticulated being, we are now speaking of the one as an articulated being, but an articulated being that has special characteristics. These characteristics are special because of its place, because of its position in the relational scale, in the relational hierarchy. And because there is this, what would I say, a significance of position because of its fundamental underpinning, we have to understand that the relationship that the one has with time is just going to be different than the expression of the one through that articulated filter of difference. Parmenides says the one was and is and will be and was coming to be and comes to be and will come to be. And so in each one of these statements, I think we can sprinkle in some relevance. The one was. Well, we could say that time is moving. We could say that of the ground has been affected by time, but it's remained stable because of its relationship. It must be stable to maintain articulated order. And given that time is something that is expressed in the articulated domain, it is something that requires a stable underlying framework. So the one was, and it was sort of maintained in that first layer. Was, is, and will be maintained in that first layer. But then we also have the articulated sense, in which we think about the one as now becoming expressed, or now compared or related to identities that have oneness, that have being, that are interacting with other identities that have oneness and that have being. And all of these will come to be, they will cease to be, there will be a now, and there will be a before and an after the now. He says something could belong to it and be of it in the past, present, and future. We could think about it again in terms of the articulation. That something is of it, that something belongs to it in the sense that, again, it participates in that field, in the foundation. It participates in the ground. It is the ground. But the ground as it is expressed in this variable difference. And it's not just variable difference in one identity, it is variable difference. It is variable proportions, the significance of those proportions between identities, the softening of relations as they communicate in time, the differing of relations as they communicate in time. And indeed, there would be knowledge and opinion and perception of it, if in fact even now we are engaging in all those activities concerning it, and a name and an account belong to it, and it is named and spoken of, and all such things as pertain to the others also pertain to the one. Now he says, let's speak of it yet a third time. If the one is, as we have described it, being both one and many, and neither one nor many, and partaking of time, Must it not, because it is one, sometimes partake of being, and in turn, because it is not, sometimes not partake of being? Necessarily. When it partakes, can it at that time not partake or partake when it doesn't? It cannot. So it partakes at one time and doesn't partake at another. For only in this way could it both partake and not partake of the same thing. That's right. Isn't there, then, a definite time when it gets a share of being and when it parts from it? Or how can it at one time have and at another time not have the same thing, if it never gets and releases it? In no way, says Aristotle. So today happens to be a new day. Now I'm thinking that I'll go through this paragraph and end this episode just so it doesn't get too long. But perhaps maybe a short reflection on who knows what might be worthwhile before I get into it. So today happens to be a Sunday. And of course, tomorrow it means the start of a new working week. And the weekends are always bittersweet. I suppose the working week is bittersweet in a way. It's funny, the relative relations among things and how they can seem almost in every instance somewhat to apply, while in other relational circumstances they don't apply at all. So in the sense that the weekend is bittersweet, there's a bitterness to it because my mind is not one that can relax easily, even if it finds itself into a state of passivity and lethargy, slothfulness, laziness, which I think it often does. It doesn't rest easy in that state. It's always moving. The internal judge is always on duty. The weekends are these moments by which the productive efforts are afforded a completely open opportunity, assuming that we finish the necessary obligations of normal life during the weekends, and the time that's left over we can devote to practices that fulfill us and fill life with a greater sense of meaning and purpose. It's not to say that the working week doesn't do this, but there's a certain solace, I think, that comes when we speak about the liberty to do what we please, the freedom of time, where we're not sort of shackled to our normal responsibilities. And the bitterness comes in when we are faced with the task of the day and maximizing that potential. It can be quite a bitter pill to swallow because, on one hand, it's usually not easy. Sometimes the fatigue from the working week carries over. Sometimes it's a matter of balance, and that it's not necessary to push in the way of excess fatigue, but rather to push in a subtle way, such that the mind is okay with the stresses that it is being asked to undergo. It's okay to do so because of the environment that it has created for itself to undergo that stress, where in most circumstances we are unable to manage such a liberty of expression and of experience. This sort of thing comes to us when we are afforded the weekend. During the week, the obligations are such that it doesn't matter what the environment is. Sorry, my cat is rubbing up against the microphone. During the working week, much of the time is spent on obligation. Again, it could be quite purposeful and directive, but all the same, there is a certain adherence and a structure, as there should be, to our productive working hours. And I think that a man can see the constraints of his experience by both his freedom to choose, but also his subjection to some authority by which he must eventually submit himself to. And it's sweet, of course, because we have the ability to choose what we do. We have the ability to engage in things that are subtle. We can build as we need to. The obligations don't immediately level the grace and the love that perhaps we would otherwise all of the time practice. And there's difficulty in there. Going back into the bitter aspects of it, the harmony is always a difficult thing. The balance is also always a difficult thing. And during the working week, of course, I've mentioned already that the obligations can often come to be a bit bitter. There are things that come up that we don't expect. When the fatigue sets in, problems, excess attention sometimes is difficult to come by. And yet we push forward because we have a responsibility, we have a duty to perform. We have a purpose to fulfill. And it's sweet because we are doing something meaningful and purposeful. Regardless of what it is, we have a job to do. We have a reason to wake up in the morning, to get out of the door, and to make the journey to work, to perform the responsibility, and to return home. We earn our value, so to speak. And I think that these reflections on the bittersweet and how both sort of exist in these environments simultaneously applies to what Parmenides is saying here in this paragraph. In the first couple sentences, he says, "Let's speak of it yet a third time. If the one is as we have described it, being both one and many, and neither one nor many, and partaking of time, must it not, because it is one, sometimes partake of being, and in turn, because it is not, sometimes not partake of being?" So the first question is, how is the one both one and many, and neither one nor many? Starting with the first, we say that the one is both one and many because, just like anything else, it is a singular identity composed of identifiable pieces. Now, as we've discussed, the pieces of the one are not as reducible as in other cases or situations and other identity states. This is more foundational. It's ground, so there's only so far we can go. The other way in which we think about it is that as we move up in the articulated order, we have the effect of the one, of its coherence between those identifiable parts. And because of that, we could say that of anything that is one, anything that is an independent identity, we are seeing the reverberations of that expression. It partakes of time because change occurs, and singular identity states are uncommon in the articulated world. We just came off of that extensive discussion about absolute time difference, but also the significance of the proportion of time between identity states. There's a complex relational dynamic that is afforded by the field of time that mixes in with the ground of oneness and being, the expression of those two, of that marriage. He says, must it not, because it is one, sometimes partake of being, and in turn, because it is not, sometimes not partake of being? Now this is where the sophist comes into play here, because the exploration and the takeaway, one of the takeaways from that dialogue, is that non-being is actually being. It's much like nothing or no thing is a term that is used within a particular set of circumstances. It is used within what we have been calling the articulated order. And because it's within this articulated order, it follows these grammatical rules. Whereas if we were talking about the absence of being, sort of like a void, then we would be in a place outside of the articulated order. For we're talking about something for which there is no coherence between oneness and being. So if there is no coherence between the ground, there's no coherence of reality. If there's no coherence of reality, we would have absence, but there would be no reality. Now, if something is not going to partake of being, that seems like a contradiction on its face. But if non-being is actually something that is, but only is in the articulated order, so in the sense of non-being in the sophist is often referred to as difference. And the analogy that I had used was using the chess piece of the king and the chess piece of the queen. The king symbolized being and the queen symbolized non-being. Two very important pieces in the game, symbolically two very important pieces. And it's not that the queen is not because she is non-being, she is equivalent to difference. There's sort of a synonymous relationship there. Now, difference is a term of relation. That we can understand difference not just by separation, but also by two different identity states compared to one another. And also, difference is that thing that performs, that makes up some of the fundamental architecture of the articulated order. If there were no difference, everything would be cohered together. There would be no difference of identity. The one would be a pure unity without difference. There would be no being in oneness. It would just be. There would be no multiplicity. There would be unity, I suppose, just one thing. But stagnant. Almost of an equivalent situation as a point of pure absence, which you can't really consider without using terms of being. Because how can you imagine a reality except by carving it out in your mind and leaving a space that is for this absolute absence? That absolute absence has a boundary around it. It becomes a thing. It becomes a thing because it is nested within a reality that requires oneness in being. So getting back to what Parmenides is saying here, what does it mean for the one sometimes to not partake of being? I think the question can be reordered, and it could be expressed as because it is one, sometimes it partakes of being, and in turn, because it is different, sometimes it does not. Sometimes it partakes of difference. Sometimes it partakes of separation or transformation. And again, non-being, in this case, we have to move away from the thought of nothingness or absence. Because that, again, has no ground to it. There's no place to build any productive thought out of it. And rationally, it would not make sense to have something partake of absence without the prior condition of being. Parmenides says, when it partakes, can it at that time not partake, or partake when it doesn't? So he's saying when it partakes of being, when the one partakes of being, and let's think about an example of what that might be. So when we're considering something that is, like either an identity that is born, or even thinking about the one as the ground in and of itself, we are thinking about something that is. And so Parmenides is asking, when it is, can it not partake of being, or partake of being when it is not? And then Aristotle says, of course it can't. And Parmenides continues and he says, so it partakes at one time and doesn't partake at another, for only in this way could it both partake and not partake of the same thing. It would be difficult to manage a contradiction state, let's say, to simultaneously hold two identities in one thing while also describing its difference. And yet, it does have this effect in the sense that there may be two separate identities that participate in some whole. We call them parts. Within our bodies, we have cells that have cell membranes around them. They are clearly their own distinct thing. They have similarities to other cells, differences with yet other cells. And yet, all of these millions and millions of cells are working together for some broader purpose, some broader whole. Now, if we took just one cell and we thought about its existence, and we thought about its existence relative to other things, we would find it quite odd, I think, if we were to consider its separation between itself and other cells. That is, focusing on the difference, what makes it different. Centering the mind on the very thing of separation, which it could be something as immediate as the cell membrane, an obvious physical barrier. But then also saying that the cell, while it participates in that difference, that its identity perhaps is consumed in that difference, or perhaps it is exhausted within that difference. But within that experience of exhaustion, what we have is a clear delineation of what is relative to that which it is not. Parmenides says, "Isn't there, then, a definite time when it gets a share of being and when it parts from it?" And I think that the share of being is when an identity is, and then its share of when it parts from it is when we are considering the liminal phase, the transitory, or maybe not transitory, but I think liminal is correct. It's that in-between space, the space of difference. Or how can it at one time have and at another time not have the same thing, if it never gets and releases it? In no way, says Aristotle. So I maintain that we solve this by the Queen's influence, by difference. So I think I'm going to end this episode here, and we're going to continue next time. I believe that there are about 10 more pages in this dialogue. We're on 388 now in my book, and it ends on 397, so we still have a good amount to go through before we finish. So until next time.